Hey everybody, welcome to the video for Unit 3. What I'm going to do to start off is I'm going to talk about Unit 2 very briefly, and then I'm going to talk about what to expect for this video and how we're going to break it down. So in Unit 2 we talked about England colonizing. We talked about the formation of Plymouth and Jamestown, and we basically talked about the different identities that formed in the northern, middle, and southern colonies. We talked about how they all belonged to England, all of these 13 colonies, and how they developed and began to create their own systems and cultures and practices. And this video is going to take that a step further. The end result of this whole unit is going to be war between England and the colonies that they established. But in order to get there, we need to understand that this is a big topic. So what we're going to do is we're going to break this topic into two different videos. The first video is going to be about the road to war, like what led to the conflict between England and her colonies. We're going to talk about radical new ideas that developed during the 18th century, which is the 1700s, rising debt and tensions, and then ultimately taxes to pay for that debt. And then finally, we'll talk about, in a second separate video, the war between England and her colonies itself. We'll talk about how the fighting looked and kind of how it all went. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to get into and start to talk about what led to tension between England and her colonies. So before we get into details on what led to England and the colonies start to beef and kind of fight with one another, I'm going to need to give you background on what was happening during the 16 and 1700s. So that's where we're going to start right now. And the first thing that I want to talk about is this idea of salutary neglect. Simply put, salutary neglect was the idea that England neglected or did not pay attention to their colonies, didn't tell them what to do, didn't put laws on them, hardly got involved in them at all between the years 1609 and 1763. This really allowed the colonies to kind of do their own thing, form their own identity, and really kind of think to themselves, yeah, we're part of the British Empire, but we're allowed to do our own thing. And that's really important to think about, because I just want to reiterate, England didn't really put any policies in place on their colonies during that time. Between the years 1609 and 1763, I'll say it a third time, England did not put any restrictions on their colonies during this time period. And I cannot emphasize that enough, that England ignored the colonies between 1609 and 1763. One of the major things that really happened during this time of salutary neglect, where England was ignoring her colonies, colonies began to form their own identity. So coming across your screen right quick is a map of where England is compared to the New World, or the 13 colonies. It's about 3,000 miles between these two, and I think that's really important because distance matters when we're talking about this conflict that starts between England and her colonies. So in the 1700s, what I really want to talk to you about is this idea of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was an incredibly important time period, and basically what happened was, before the 1700s, people thought, hey, I need to do everything for the king. I need to live for the king or queen. I need to make sure that the money I produce goes to the king. Everything I do is for the betterment of the king. However, right around the 1700s, you have several individuals who come up with new ideas. Ultimately, while there's a bunch of different ideas that form, it boils down to one thing: a shift in the idea on how people view government. The idea that I should do stuff for the government began to change. People began to think, wait a second, if there's one king or queen, or if there's only a small handful of people in charge, why should I be doing stuff for them? They, the government, should be looking out for me, since there's a lot more of us. And so when you talk about the Enlightenment, a number of people introduced new ideas. A guy named John Locke was like the granddaddy of the Enlightenment. He's pictured here. His idea was government's power stems from its people, and he believed that all people were born with life, liberty, and property. And we'll get into that when we talk about the foundations of our government. But basically, another major idea of his that I'm going to say probably a million times in this video is that he instilled this idea that if the citizens of a government do not like what's happening, if they don't like the laws that are being put in place, they can ignore it or change it. And if they don't like the government that's in place, that it's their right and their duty to overthrow that government. Like, that is what he said, and it's a pretty revolutionary idea. And so I cannot emphasize the importance of that enough, that John Locke had a few really, really strong ideas. And it all boils down to that the government should work for the people and not the opposite way around. Other folks who came up with ideas during this time was a gentleman by the name of Baron de Montesquieu. His idea was separation of powers, that we shouldn't have one person who's in charge, that we should split the powers up into several branches of government. And that's really important because that's basically the basis of our government today. Additionally, you had a guy named Voltaire. He believed that people should have freedom of religion and expression and thought. And then you had a guy named Beccaria. He believed in the abolition of torture. And that government should not have the rights to torture people to get answers from them if they're questioning them, or they shouldn't be able to torture them to get a confession, or whatever it might be. And so all of these ideas ultimately boil down to, like I've said before, that government should work for the people, that the people are more important than a select few governing body people. And so to say all that, I'm going to show this chart real quick of all these Enlightenment philosophers and where their ideas are found in our government. And I'll put it up there for, I don't know, 5 seconds, but you could certainly pause it and take a look and maybe even take a picture of this, because this is going to be really, really important. So basically, I'll say it once more. This idea of the Enlightenment came about during the 1700s. It was a shift in the way people viewed government, that, hey, government should work for us, we shouldn't work for government. Cake. So where, like, is that actually found? Like, where is that found in history? Because, look, ideas are nice, but I like to see ideas applied. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about right now. So one of the most obvious and first times that we see this idea of the Enlightenment put into practice was in the year 1688. In 1688, there was something called the Glorious Revolution. We talked about the Anglican Church, or the Church of England. Now, King James II, the king during this time, was a king that believed in Catholicism, and he tried to change the religion of England to Catholicism. And so the people of England began to become quite scared, because their thought process was, well, if he has a child, then that child is going to be Catholic, and then their child will be Catholic, and then all of a sudden we have a line of kings or queens that are just completely Catholic and not necessarily in the best interest of the Church of England, because by the 1680s, 1690s, the Church of England was very much a very popular part of English culture. Anglican culture, if you will, the Church of England. So what happened was Mary, who was James II's daughter, and her husband William decided to overthrow the standing king, which is King James II. This was Mary's own father. And they overthrew him, but nobody was killed. It's actually called the Bloodless Revolution. And the details of this aren't as important as one major thing. The people didn't like the religion that King James II had. So what they did was they overthrew him and ended his rule. And I think that's really important because, again, the idea of the Enlightenment is if we don't like things, we can change it. And this is how it was found in England. Now, talking about the colonies, as you see pictured here, there were several ways that the Enlightenment was found in the colonies, and the first of which was King James before he was overthrown. Right around the time of the Glorious Revolution in 1688, King James II enacted something called the Dominion of New England, and what he did was he sent a gentleman named Sir Edmund Andros over to the colonies because King James II believed that he wanted to have more control of the colonies. Remember when I talked about earlier this idea of salutary neglect, that England hadn't put any policies or rules in place for the colonies, that they had kind of governed themselves. So with this idea of the Dominion of New England and sending a governor over to kind of assert more control, the people of the colonies were not happy with this at all. And so some of the ways that Sir Edmund Andros, this governor that was sent over by King James II, tried to put more control over the colonies is he tried to enforce certain taxes. He did away with town meetings, where we talked about the northern colonies. That was a huge, important part of the identity of the northern colonies. They had come over there for religious freedoms, and to have this governor come over saying, hey, you can't have these town meetings anymore, was an insult to them, and they did not like this. So what the colonists of New England did, because this Dominion of New England was in New England, in the northern colonies, they ran Sir Edmund Andros out of town. They said, if you don't get out of here, we're going to kill you. This set a standard where the colonies were not going to be told what they could and could not do by England. And so the colonists ran him out of town. And so this definitely furthers the colonies' own identity that they are not going to be told what to do. Additionally, there was something called the First Great Awakening. First Great Awakening happened a little bit later on. It was in the 1730s and 1740s, where the Dominion of New England happened in the 1680s. My point in all this is the First Great Awakening during the 1730s and 40s, church officials in the colonies believed that people had begun to kind of go away from the Church of England. And a large part of this was because people had felt that the religion was kind of dry and boring, and uh, that they weren't really interested in this idea of religion. And so preachers felt that they needed a more interesting way of approaching teaching the religious faith. And so there was this new style of teaching that was loud and hype, and people were really passionate about the way that they went about teaching their sermons. And the older folks of the Puritan variety and the Church of England variety thought that this went completely against religion. And so this new style of teaching became known as the New Lights. And this older style of teaching, this more boring and dry version, was called the Old Lights. And so this idea, the Great Awakening, pulled people back to the church. Well, these new style of preachers didn't want to go back to this old way of church. And so what did the folks of the colonies do? They created their own branches of religion. And you had several new branches of religion form as pictured here. And so, again, this is the Enlightenment idea. Realize that if you don't like something, you can change it. If you don't like the way things are going, you can modify it and create your own thing. And that's exactly what happened during the First Great Awakening. So, colonies began to form their own identity. There were new branches of religion because of the First Great Awakening. The existing religions, the diverse religions of the colonies, were way different than England. The House of Burgesses that we talked about in Unit 2 down south, and these town meetings up north, were examples of them governing themselves and them forming their own identity and saying, we are not going to necessarily follow what the king does because he's 3,000 miles away. Additionally, when Sir Edmund Andros was sent over, they said, we're not going to take this governor coming over here and telling us what to do. We're not standing for it. We're our own economy. Which brings me to my last point, is that they traded their own goods to England. They produced their own goods. And so the colonies very much had their own identity compared to England. They had their own things going on. And so in the late 1600s, early to mid 1700s, you see this split start to form between England and her colonies. And I think that that's really important. So what we're going to do is talk about the main event that led the colonies and England to kind of separate. And so we need background on what was going on with England. We talked about what was going on with the colonies. Now we're going to talk about what was going on in England. So if you take a look at this map, there are several European powers. We talked about Spain in the south, but what I didn't talk to you about was the fact that France had a large swath of territory that was right next to England. And between the years 1702 and 1739, England and France fought several wars between one another, okay? And matter of fact, they fought 3 wars, and England won all of them. But the big deal comes in 1749. If you take a look at this map of the Ohio River Valley, basically England was pushing westward, France was pushing eastward, and so they kind of all meet. England does, and France meets, and kind of collide with one another in the Ohio River Valley. And the people who were there, who had been pushed west by the British, were the Native Americans. And so the French did not want the British to expand into their territory, and the British didn't want the French to expand into their territory. And the poor Native Americans were caught in the middle. And so we know that England had traditionally killed the Native Americans and pushed them westward. And so the Native Americans, once war broke out between England and France, took France's side, which brings me to this major idea. In 1754, 6 years after this tension started between England and France in the Ohio River Valley, the French and Indian War broke out. And by the name, you would think that the French and Indians were fighting one another. That's not the case. This war is from an English perspective, the name of this war, that is. And so the French and Indians were the people that the British were fighting. Hence, you have the French and Indian War. And so in 1754, a massive war breaks out between England and France. Basically, if you take a look at this map, fighting started in the New World, but then it spread to the Old World in Europe, and even parts of India, France and England were fighting. So this was a massive conflict between these two. If you take a look at this map, and Tom, the map's on slide 207. If you take a look at this map, at the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, France lost most of its territory in the New World, and Spain gained a ton of territory. And I'm saying all this to say is, yes, England was successful in getting new territory, but the major problem was that war costs a lot of money. And so, because war cost all this money, England had run up a large debt. They had fought 3 wars before this and this massive war between England and France. And so England had a lot of money that they owed. And so, again, to recap what we talked about the colonies, England hadn't bothered the colonies at all up until 1763. They hadn't bothered them at all. There were new branches of religions forming in the colonies. There was existing religions in the colonies. There was their own governments in the colonies. There was a failed attempt at England to try and assert control over the colonies with the Dominion of New England, and the colonies had their own economy. The colonies had their own identity, and so England was in a ton of debt. And so how do countries pay their debt? Well, they tax their citizens, and so this is all coming together where there's a number of different things. So if you take a look at this thing that I drew, in one circle you have the Enlightenment. On the other circle, you have colony's identity that I've gone over twice. And then you have this idea of salutary neglect in this other circle. And then you have England being involved in a ton of debt in that final fourth circle. All of these happenings during the 1700s, or 16 and 1700s, lead to a major problem when England needs to tax for the debt that they have. So now we're going to get into these taxes and acts. Like I said, England had been fighting wars, and wars cost money. So what England did was they said, hey, we need money, so we're going to tax the colonies. And so with this idea of the Enlightenment, the colonists were like, I don't need to do stuff for the government should provide things for me. With this idea of colonial identity, the colonists were like, wait a second, we weren't the ones who started this war, England did. And while they helped us and kicked the French out, that's great, but we didn't ask them to do that. And with all of these different colonial pieces of identity that the colonists had developed over a course of 150 years, they felt no need to pay taxes to England. So there was a number of taxes and acts that happened between 1763, and the colonists reacted to these taxes and acts. I'm not going to go over all these taxes and acts because they can be found in your Unit 2 and 3 work document. But I will go over several examples to get you started so that you can understand what I'm talking about when I say taxes put in place and colonial reaction. So the first thing that I want to talk about was something called Pontiac's Rebellion. Basically what it was is farmers out west were being attacked by Native Americans, and this cartoon represents the British reaction. But basically the British said, hey, look, these Native Americans, we can't protect you from them. We're already running a huge debt, and it's easier for us to say, hey, any colonists are not allowed to go past this boundary, and that boundary was the Appalachian Mountains. And this was called the Proclamation Line. Essentially, this was England putting a policy in place to the colonists, and the colonists got very angry. They said, what are you talking about? We're not allowed to settle west. Like, that's the whole point of us coming over to the New World, is that we can get land and we can settle. So the colonists got very, very angry at this. A second example, the British put in place something called the Stamp Act in 1765. And in 1765, they put a tax on any good that required a stamp, and that could be any legal document. That's anything required paper, essentially required a stamp. And so the colonists thought this was wildly unfair. They said, why should we have to pay taxes on anything that requires paper? That doesn't make sense to us. And so what they did was they formed something called the Stamp Act Congress. And in the Stamp Act Congress, in the same year, 1765, the colonists from 9 different colonies got together and formed several things. First was a saying, no taxation without representation, aka we are not being represented in English government, so why should we be taxed? The second thing, they agreed on a non-importation agreement, that they weren't going to import or take in British goods, which would hurt the British economy, so that they would end the Stamp Act. And then the third thing was they agreed that a group called the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, they were a rebellious group of colonists that the women were the Daughters of Liberty. They would make goods for families so that they didn't need to use British goods. So instead of using cotton clothing, they would use sheep's wool and make their own clothes out of sheep's wool instead of buying goods from England. The Sons of Liberty, what they would do was a lot more extreme. They would literally go into a tax collector's house. They would trash their house and sometimes even kill the tax collector by tar and feathering them, which means that they would pour hot tar all over these tax collectors' bodies and throw feathers on them so they look like a chicken, put them on a rail and run them out of town, and they would die of that. And so eventually England ended the Stamp Act. And so this is the Enlightenment idea realized. If you don't like something, ignore it, change it, or fight back against it. And when they did that, they were successful. This is the Enlightenment realized. Hey, we didn't like something, so we forced the government to change it. The last example that I want to go over is the Boston Tea Act in May of 1773. Basically, what the Tea Act said was the British government has a ton of leftover tea, and tea was a major part of the colonists and British daily lives. And so the British government said, we have all this leftover tea, and we want you to buy this tea from us. We want you to buy the tea from the British government. And so it was forcing them to buy tea, and you couldn't sell tea if you weren't part of the British government. And so in 1773, this act went into place, and the colonists were like, I want to be able to buy tea from whoever I want to buy it from. I don't want to be forced to buy tea from the British East India Company, which was owned by the government. That's technically who they bought the tea from, was the British East India Company, but still it was through the British government. And so in 1773, in December of 1773, a number of colonists dressed up as Native Americans went onto British ships and threw tea into Boston Harbor and really got the British government officials mad because they destroyed thousands of dollars worth of tea. And so a lot of these first examples of resistance happen in Boston. And so Boston becomes the powder keg, just as an aside. England responded to the colonists' actions with something called the Intolerable Acts. They shut down Boston's port. They said you're no longer allowed to have your own government, and a number of other things with these Intolerable Acts. And so my point is not for you to memorize it, but is that the British put in place taxes or acts, and the colonists reacted. And so tensions are rising between England and the colonies. And I think it's important that when we talk about this, that you understand that these are only three examples: the Boston Tea Party, the Stamp Act, and the Proclamation Act. These are only three examples. When you do the activity, I think you need to realize that there are a number of acts and acts that lead to fighting. And so in 1774, 12 out of the 13 colonies get together in something called the First Continental Congress and create a Declaration of Rights and Grievances. They have complaints against the British government, and they create something called the Non-Importation Act that said, hey, we will not import any British goods, any of the 12 out of the 13 colonies. And this is really important because it shows now all the colonies are banding together to push back against British tax and acts. And this is, again, the Enlightenment idea is realized that they didn't like something, so they're going to take action to try and change it or ignore the laws put into place. And so tensions continue to rise between England and the colonists. Everything reaches a breaking point on April 19th, 1775, when the British send soldiers at night to arrest John Hancock and Sam Adams. They were two individuals who were part of the Sons of Liberty. They were considered to be major leaders of the Sons of Liberty, and the British soldiers were there to arrest them. And so Paul Revere, a patriot as well, somebody who was who was with the colonists, said, you know what, I'm going to run from town to town and tell these towns that the British are coming and that they're coming to arrest John Hancock and Sam Adams, and these two major officials for the colonists. And so as Paul Revere goes from town to town, people called Minutemen, they were soldiers who were ready in a minute's notice with guns, all formed together in Lexington, Massachusetts. By the time the British soldiers get there, all these colonists are waiting there with guns, and they're yapping back and forth at each other. Somebody fires, and a whole battle breaks out. The colonists are not well-trained soldiers, and they retreated. They got their butts kicked in Lexington, and this is known as the shot heard around the world because it essentially was a huge deal that this group of farmers with pitchforks essentially are fighting back against one of the biggest countries and biggest, strongest countries in the world. These colonists retreat to Concord, where there's an arsenal. An arsenal is a place where there's tons of weapons. They take the arsenal, and the British soldiers come into Concord. There was a lot more soldiers. There's a lot more colonists, Minutemen, ready to go, and they fight these British soldiers. The British soldiers start to get their butts kicked. They run themselves all the way back to Boston, where they had put thousands of soldiers because of the Boston Tea Party. As I had mentioned earlier, there was thousands of soldiers in Boston, and 20,000 Minutemen over the next few weeks swarm together, band together, surround Boston, and put it under siege. A siege is where you don't let anybody in or out of the city, and the idea is to starve the enemy out, and it eventually works. Boston falls, and the colonists take over. And in May of 1775, there's the Second Continental Congress where all 13 colonies meet together. There was no call to break away from England. I want to be very clear here that the colonies did not want to break away from England at this point. They were just sick and tired of taxes and being oppressed or put down by the British. And so in this Second Continental Congress with all 13 colonies, they agreed on three things. They'd create a colonial army and navy, which is the first thing. Number two, that they would start to raise money and get money from other countries to build an army and a navy. And the third thing was that they wanted to fight England, not for independence, not to break away, not to form their own country, but they wanted to fight England to the point where England would just say, you know what? This is not worth our time and effort in fighting. Let's just end the taxes, and we'll let the colonies kind of do what they want to do. I want to say that these colonists very much wanted to be part of England. They wanted to be part of the British Empire, but they did not want to be told what to do. And I think that that's significant because there's a big difference between wanting to be part of the British Empire and break away. The colonists did not want to break away. And so in May of 1775, all 13 colonies get together and they agree on the major thing, which is they want to fight England, not to break away, but so that they can continue to govern themselves and form their own practices while still being part of the British Empire. The next video you're going to see is what escalates this conflict even further, how they go into all-out war, and eventually how this idea of wanting to break away and form their own country forms by the 13 colonists.